Hello, fellow cyborgs, and welcome to a book review of Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates. I read this with the lovely Sabrina from Unmanaged Mischief, and I had a really great time reading this and also chatting with her about it. But before I tell you why, book haiku. Pinned down and labeled, we are trapped in the horrors of mediocrity. Revolutionary Road is a modern American classic that comes highly recommended from many people, including Mercedes of Mercy's Bookish Musing, upon whose recommendation and because of whose review I picked this up in the first place. This follows a married couple in their mid-20s, something like that. Frank and April Wheeler, who are currently living in suburbia in, I believe, Connecticut or Vermont, in the New England area, and are kind of hating life. April and Frank always considered themselves to be above suburbia and the American dream, and yet have somehow found themselves right in the middle of it. So this book explores and picks apart the illusion of the American dream, and also the gender stereotypes and social stereotypes and conditions in a post-World War II era. I loved this. I could not stop reading it, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I left poor Sabrina in the dust because I just had such a hard time putting this down. Most of that was due to Richard Yates' glorious writing style. I absolutely loved how he wrote. And for me, I on the surface would not be interested in reading about the American dream. The Great Gatsby can just go hang out with the kids who like it, because that's not me. But the way that Richard Yates writes, I would read practically anything that he wrote. If he wanted to write about the dung beetle, I would probably read about it with great enthusiasm. Let me read you a couple paragraphs so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. The final dying sounds of their dress rehearsal left the Laurel players with nothing to do but stand there, silent and helpless, blinking out over the footlights of an empty auditorium. They hardly dared to breathe as the short, solemn figure of their director emerged from the naked seats to join them on stage, as he pulled a stepladder raspingly from the wings and climbed halfway up its rungs to turn and tell them, with several clearings of his throat, that they were a damned talented group of people and a wonderful group of people to work with. "It hasn't been an easy job," he said, his glasses glinting soberly around the stage. "We've had a lot of problems here, and quite frankly I'd more or less resigned myself to not expect too much. Well, listen, maybe this sounds corny, but something happened up here tonight. Sitting out there tonight, I suddenly knew, deep down, that you were all putting your hearts into your work for the first time." He let the fingers of one hand splay out across the pocket of his shirt to show what a simple, physical thing the heart was. Then he made the same hand into a fist, which he shook slowly and wordlessly in a long dramatic pause, closing one eye and allowing his moist lower lip to curl out in a grimace of triumph and pride. "Do that again tomorrow night," he said, "and we'll have one hell of a show." They could have wept with relief. Instead, trembling, they cheered and laughed and shook hands and kissed one another, and somebody went out for a case of beer, and they all sang songs around the auditorium piano until the time came to agree, unanimously, that they'd better knock it off and get a good night's sleep. "See you tomorrow," they called, as happy as children, and riding home under the moon, they found they could roll down the windows of their cars and let the air in, with its health-giving smells of loam and young flowers. It was the first time many of the Laurel players had allowed themselves to acknowledge the coming of spring. I hope you see what I mean, because, Richard Yates. Apart from the absolutely beautiful writing style, Richard Yates is a master at being able to peg people psychologically within a matter of paragraphs. It reminded me so much of John Steinbeck's work in East of Eden, which is a most beloved book of mine. You know, it's my new favorite book of all time. For instance, Frank, which no reader can really say that they like, I found that I could sympathize with him, with the fact that of the masculinity and the time that he was put in. He was a war hero of sorts and remembers the war in all of its glory and commendation. And now he's come back to a society that perhaps is safer and simpler, but you can't dream in. Frank is also constantly fighting to prove his masculinity in much the same way of the hoorah macho man in the military, but at least there you knew you were doing something masculine, whereas because now that he's an office worker and he lives at home with his wife and 2 kids, he's having to spend a ton of mental energy on the little tiny body gestures that for him prove his masculinity, which he is so desperate to exude. April is also a really interesting character. She's cold and aloof, and I found she kept me at a distance, but I think that's because she doesn't fit into the suburban world with its gender stereotypes. In fact, April at times is more masculine of a character than Frank, and the sorts of decisions that she makes and the sorts of thoughts that she has would perhaps be celebrated were she a man, whereas as a woman, she's told that she's being inappropriate. Both Frank and April are stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's a sort of situation that they allowed themselves to be in and allow themselves to remain in. But just because they have agency, it doesn't mean that it's any easier to deal with or any easier to change. There's a character with mental illness in this book, which amazingly showcases how insane suburbia and the posturing of the American dream can be. He, through his mental illness, through his perceived craziness, is allowed to impinge upon social mores and says things that are completely true and honest, but that everyone else around him have agreed to say nothing about, and in fact, maybe have agreed to hide. Yates points out the hypocrisy within suburbia, the fact that the American dream is an unachievable dream, and trying to pretend that you have achieved it is nothing more than just lying to yourself and the people around you. And also he argues how the American dream perhaps isn't something we should be striving towards if it was even possible to attain. But overall, like I said, it's Yates' writing style and his characterization that is just on point, masterful, and oh so poignant. I absolutely loved this, and I thought that the plot and everything that happens within this relatively short work just is perfectly wrapped up. It's just this little nugget of perfection as far as storytelling and character development goes. It was brilliant. I'm so dang impressed, and this has easily made it to my list of my favorite books of 2016. Thank you for watching this review. I hope that I have convinced some of you to pick up Revolutionary Road, even though perhaps in its back blurb it wouldn't otherwise attract your attention. Please let me know in the comments down below what books have snuck onto your list of top books of this year, and until next time, I hope that you add at least one more to that top books list and continue to be lovely. And thank you to my patrons from Patreon. I appreciate your continued support. I hope that you are currently reading a book that is going to be in your top books for this year. And as always, that you too continue to be lovely. Pinned down and labeled, we are trapped in the... It'll be fine. Don't worry. And thank you to my patrons for supporting... Ooh.